Keanu Reeves to his abandoned childhood home, only to find a dog identical to Max, his beloved pet who died 25 years ago. First, the reunion feels like a miracle, but strange occurrences begin. Max moves too perfectly, remembers too much, and leads Keanu to a buried secret beneath the house. As memories resurface, Keanu recalls his father's fearful warning, "Forget this place. Never come back." But it's too late. Something was buried that night, something not meant to return. In a horrifying revelation, Keanu realizes the truth. Max isn't Max, and beneath the house, something unnatural is still waiting. What did you think of this story? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to DG Sorry for more thrilling tales. Your support keeps us going. The road leading to Keanu's childhood home was eerily quiet. Tall oak trees lined both sides of the path, their branches intertwining like old friends sharing whispers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the cracked pavement, and the scent of damp earth mixed with decaying leaves filled the air. Keanu tightened his grip on the steering wheel, exhaling slowly as he pulled up in front of the house he hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. It looked just as he remembered, only older, more worn. The once bright blue paint had faded to a dull gray, and the wooden steps creaked under the weight of time. The windows were clouded with dust, and ivy had begun to creep up the walls, reclaiming the space as its own. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the house. It had been years since his parents passed away, and though he had meant to return earlier, life had a way of pushing memories aside. But now, with legal matters forcing him to deal with the abandoned property, he had no excuse to keep avoiding it. With a deep breath, Keanu stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the front porch. He hesitated before turning the doorknob, half expecting to hear his mother's voice calling him inside, or the familiar sound of paws scratching against the wooden floor. But there was nothing, only silence. Inside, dust covered everything like a thin layer of forgotten time. The furniture remained untouched, just as it had been left. He ran his fingers over the old oak table, tracing the scratches and dents, each one a reminder of a childhood long gone. His gaze wandered to the fireplace, where a rusted dog collar still hung from a nail. Max. A lump formed in his throat at the sight of it. Max had been more than just a dog. He had been Keanu's best friend, his shadow. They had been inseparable, sharing adventures in the woods, chasing fireflies, and curling up together on cold winter nights. The thought of Max still brought both warmth and an ache to his chest. But Max was gone, just like his parents, just like everything else in this house that once made it a home. Keanu sighed, shaking his head as if to clear away the emotions threatening to surface. He wasn't here to reminisce, just to take care of paperwork, make sure everything was in order, and leave. Or at least, that was the plan. But then, something outside caught his attention. A movement near the tree line. Keanu turned toward the window, narrowing his eyes. A dog, standing just beyond the edge of the woods, watching him. It wasn't the presence of the dog itself that sent a shiver down his spine, but the way it looked at him, as if it knew him, as if it had been waiting. Keanu's breath hitched as he stared at the dog. It stood motionless at the edge of the woods, partially concealed by the fading light of the setting sun. Its fur was golden, tinged with streaks of white along its chest and paws. But what unsettled Keanu the most was its eyes, deep brown, filled with an eerie familiarity that sent chills down his spine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the dog took a step forward. Keanu's first instinct was to dismiss it as a stray, but something about the way it moved, the way it watched him, made his chest tighten. It wasn't just wandering, it was observing. He stepped onto the porch, his boots echoing against the hollow wooden planks. "Hey there, buddy," he called out, his voice softer than he expected. The dog's ears perked up. It took another step forward, then another, until it was just a few feet from the porch. Keanu crouched down, extending a hand. "Where did you come from?" "Ha!" The dog didn't flinch. It didn't growl or shy away. Instead, it sat down, tail wagging slightly, just like Max used to. A sharp pang of nostalgia hit Keanu like a wave crashing against rock. He shook his head, mentally scolding himself. This isn't Max. Max is gone. But the resemblance was uncanny. Keanu swallowed hard, forcing himself to think logically. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe this was just another dog with similar features. He knew better than to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this encounter. "Do you have an owner?" he asked, scanning the dog's neck. No collar, no tags. Its fur, though slightly ruffled, didn't look like that of a stray. Someone had to be taking care of it. The dog stood up, wagging its tail in slow, deliberate movements, then, without hesitation, trotted past Keanu and climbed onto the porch, like it had done it 1,000 times before. Keanu stiffened. His heart pounded. The dog sniffed the air, then turned in a circle before settling down right on the spot where Max used to sleep. Keanu's breath hitched again. This was too much. He took a step back, rubbing his temples. It's just a dog. It's just a damn dog. But no matter how many times he repeated it, something deep inside him screamed otherwise. The dog lifted its head, looking at him again with those impossibly familiar eyes. And for the first time in years, Keanu felt like he wasn't alone in that house. Keanu exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if to clear away the strange thoughts creeping into his mind. It's just a coincidence. That's all it was. Yet, as he stood there watching the dog curl up on the porch like it had always belonged there, doubt gnawed at the edges of his rationality. He stepped closer, kneeling beside it. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move away. Slowly, Keanu reached out a hand and let his fingers brush against its fur. It was warm, thick, and slightly rough, just like Max's had been. His heart clenched. The dog closed its eyes for a moment, then shifted its weight slightly, exposing its front paw. Keanu froze. A small, crescent-shaped scar marred the soft fur just above the paw, the exact same scar Max had gotten as a puppy when he had stepped on a rusty nail in the backyard. Keanu's stomach dropped. His fingers hovered over the scar as old memories surged forward like a tidal wave. He had been just 10 years old, crying his eyes out while his father had carefully bandaged Max's paw. The guilt of letting his best friend get hurt had eaten him alive for days. But that was years ago. Max was gone. Keanu jerked his hand back, standing up so fast he nearly lost his balance. His breathing turned shallow. This isn't possible. The dog opened its eyes again, gazing up at him with that same quiet understanding. It didn't move, didn't react to his panic, simply watched. Keanu took a shaky step backward. His mind was racing, scrambling for an explanation that made sense. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. Maybe this was Max's offspring or some distant descendant that had inherited his habits. Maybe the scar was just another bizarre accident, a freak occurrence. But deep down, he knew better. This was Max. Somehow, in some impossible way, the dog in front of him was the same companion he had lost all those years ago. A cold shiver ran down Keanu's spine, but not out of fear. It was something else, something unexplainable. The weight of the past pressed down on him like a thick fog, suffocating and yet strangely comforting. For the first time in years, he felt that familiar warmth of having his best friend by his side. Keanu let out a shaky breath. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, but Max had come back. Keanu sat on the worn-out porch steps, staring at the dog curled up beside him. The cool evening breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. Despite the quiet of his surroundings, his mind was anything but calm. The scar, the way the dog responded to his voice, the way it walked into this house as if it belonged here, it all felt too real to be a coincidence. Keanu ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered under his breath. The dog, Max lifted its head slightly at the sound of his voice, but didn't move from its spot. It just looked at him, its eyes reflecting the dim light from the setting sun. Keanu hesitated before speaking again. "You're not supposed to be here." Max's tail wagged slowly, rhythmically, just like it used to when Keanu would talk to him after a long day. A lump formed in Keanu's throat. "I buried you," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, as if saying it louder would break whatever strange reality he had found himself in. The dog didn't respond, not in words, at least, but its presence alone was answer enough. Keanu rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the impossible. He had held Max in his arms the night he passed away. He had dug the grave himself under the old oak tree in the backyard. He had felt the final breath leave his best friend's body. And yet, here Max was, lying beside him like nothing had changed. "Maybe I'm losing it," Keanu murmured. He hadn't been back to this house in years. Maybe the overwhelming memories were playing tricks on his mind. Maybe grief never really went away. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the porch. The air grew cooler, but Keanu barely noticed. He was too lost in thought, staring at the dog that shouldn't exist. And then, Max did something that shattered any last doubt Keanu had left. He nudged Keanu's hand with his nose, then pressed his head against Keanu's leg, just like he always used to when he sensed something was wrong. Keanu felt his breath hitch. It wasn't just any dog. It was him. And suddenly, the impossible didn't seem so impossible anymore. Keanu sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Max, or whatever this was, had just nudged him in the same way he always did when Keanu was upset as a kid. It was something uniquely theirs, a silent language that had once been second nature. But how could this be real? His fingers trembled as he slowly reached out again, brushing them through the dog's thick fur. It was warm, alive. Max leaned into his touch, letting out a deep, content sigh. Keanu's breath came out unsteady. He had expected some kind of reaction, something to remind him that this wasn't real, that he was imagining everything. But the way Max felt, the way he reacted, it was all too familiar, too real. He swallowed hard. "Where the hell did you come from?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but after a moment, he stood up, stretched his legs, and walked straight toward the backyard. Keanu's heart nearly stopped. His stomach twisted. The oak tree. Max padded toward it with purpose, his tail wagging slightly, as if guiding Keanu somewhere he already knew. Keanu hesitated before standing, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He followed, his boots crunching against the dry leaves scattered along the ground. His breath grew shallow as he approached the base of the old oak, the place where, 25 years ago, he had dug a small grave with his own hands. And then Max did something that made Keanu's blood run cold. He sat down directly over the spot where he had been buried. Keanu's throat went dry. The air around him suddenly felt thick, suffocating. His vision blurred at the edges as he stared down at the dog, at the impossible reality in front of him. Max's deep brown eyes locked onto his, and Keanu swore there was something more in them, an awareness, a knowing. Keanu took a step back, his mind screaming for logic, for reason. "This isn't possible," he muttered, shaking his head. "It can't be." But Max didn't disappear. He didn't fade into thin air like a ghost should. He simply sat there, wagging his tail softly, waiting for Keanu to understand. Keanu's pulse pounded in his ears. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He looked down at Max, or whatever this was, sitting calmly over the very spot where he had buried his best friend 25 years ago. His mind screamed for a logical explanation. Maybe this wasn't Max. Maybe it was just a stray that happened to look like him, act like him, sit in the same damn place he had been laid to rest. But what were the chances of that? Keanu swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists. He needed to test this. Needed proof that he wasn't losing his grip on reality. Taking a shaky breath, he crouched down in front of the dog, "All right," he murmured. "Let's see if you really are who I think you are." Max tilted his head, ears perked up in curiosity. Keanu hesitated, then whistled a short, two-note sound he used to call Max when they played in the fields as kids. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, Max's ears twitched. He stood up slowly, tail wagging, and walked toward Keanu in an almost playful manner. His head nudged against Keanu's knee, just like he always did when he was called. Keanu's chest tightened. His heart thumped erratically. No stray dog would know that. He felt a cold rush of emotions, a mix of fear, wonder, and an overwhelming sense of something he couldn't explain. His fingers brushed against Max's fur again. The warmth was undeniable. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't some illusion. He was real. Keanu's breath trembled as he spoke the name again, this time barely a whisper. "Max!" The dog responded immediately, tail wagging harder, stepping closer, as if he had been waiting for Keanu to say it all along. Keanu felt something break inside him. Disbelief, grief, longing, it all came crashing down at once. His eyes burned as he ran a shaky hand over Max's head. "How?" he croaked. "How are you here?" Max didn't answer, but the way he leaned into Keanu's touch, the way his body felt warm and real, the way he had come back to him after all these years. Maybe Keanu didn't need an answer. Keanu sat back on his heels, his breathing uneven. He had spent years trying to forget, trying to move on, but now the past was staring him right in the face. Alive, breathing, and wagging its tail. His mind raced. Was this even possible? Could a dog truly return after death? Reincarnation? A ghost in a physical form? He had never believed in such things. Yet, here Max was. Keanu swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, his hands unsteady. "If you're really Max," he whispered, "then you remember this, don't you?" Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, rusted keychain, a small, silver whistle attached to a worn leather strap. It was the same whistle he had used to train Max as a puppy, the one he had used to call him home every evening before dinner, the one he had buried alongside him all those years ago. The whistle should be 6 feet under the ground, and yet, here he was, holding it in his trembling fingers. Max's ears perked up the moment Keanu held it out. His tail wagged excitedly, his paws shifting as if waiting for something. Keanu hesitated, then placed the whistle to his lips. A single sharp note rang through the air. For a moment, everything went still. Then Max bolted, not away, toward him. With the same speed and eagerness he had when he was a puppy, Max lunged forward, pushing his weight against Keanu's chest, knocking him backward onto the grass. His tongue darted out, licking Keanu's face furiously, his tail wagging in pure excitement. Keanu let out a choked laugh, tears burning behind his eyes. He couldn't stop them even if he wanted to. His arms wrapped around the dog, holding him tight. This wasn't just any dog. It was him. The weight of that realization crashed over Keanu like a tidal wave. He buried his face into Max's fur, letting out a shaky breath. For years, he had thought he had lost his best friend forever. But Max had found his way back. And this time, Keanu wasn't going to let him go. Keanu sat on the grass for what felt like hours, his arms still wrapped around Max as if afraid the dog might vanish if he let go. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant sound of crickets chirping in the woods. The reality of the moment weighed heavily on him. Max was here, alive, real, but the question remained. How? As the initial shock began to wear off, a strange unease settled in Keanu's chest. His logical mind still refused to accept what his heart already knew. Dogs didn't just come back after 25 years. Keanu slowly pulled away and looked at Max, who stared back at him with those impossibly familiar eyes. "You shouldn't be here," Keanu murmured. He wasn't even sure if he meant it as a question or a statement. Max simply tilted his head. Keanu sighed, rubbing his face. Maybe he was exhausted, hallucinating. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him after being back in this house, surrounded by old memories. But when he opened his eyes, Max was still there. Keanu exhaled sharply and stood up. "All right," he muttered. "If you're really here, then you're coming inside with me." Max's tail wagged, and without hesitation, he trotted toward the house, as if he already knew the way. Keanu frowned but didn't say anything. He followed, his heart pounding against his ribs as he stepped back inside. The house was dimly lit by the kitchen light he had left on earlier. The wooden floors creaked beneath his weight. He hadn't planned on staying overnight, but now, he wasn't sure he could bring himself to leave. Max walked through the house with perfect familiarity, barely sniffing around like a dog in a new environment would. Instead, he moved with confidence like he had never left. Keanu watched him carefully. Then, Max walked straight to the living room and curled up beside the old fireplace, in the exact spot he used to sleep in as a puppy. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't normal. The scar, the whistle, the old habits, everything about this dog screamed Max. But how could that be possible? Keanu sat down on the couch, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to process everything. Something was happening, something he couldn't explain. And for the first time that night, Keanu wondered, had Max really come back? Or was something else at play? Keanu sat in silence, watching Max curled up beside the fireplace, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. The warmth of the room, the faint crackle of old wooden beams settling, it all felt too much like the past, like he had stepped into a memory instead of reality. But reality didn't work like this. Keanu clenched his jaw. Something was wrong. His hands curled into fists against his knees as his thoughts raced. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe it was just a dog that happened to look and move exactly like Max. Maybe. But then Max did something that sent a chill down Keanu's spine. In his sleep, the dog let out a soft, muffled whimper. Keanu froze. It wasn't just any whimper. It was the exact same nightmare sound Max used to make as a puppy, soft, distressed, almost like a child talking in his sleep. A memory flashed in Keanu's mind. As a kid, whenever Max had that particular whimper, Keanu would reach out and rub the spot between his ears, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. I'm here." And like clockwork, Max's whimpering would stop. Keanu swallowed hard. His body moved before his mind could catch up. With a shaky hand, he reached out and gently rubbed the spot between Max's ears. The moment his fingers made contact, the dog let out a long, contented sigh just like he always had before. Keanu yanked his hand back as if he had been burned. His breathing turned shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't a coincidence. This was real. Keanu pushed himself off the couch and backed away slowly, his legs unsteady. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He turned away, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter for support. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened kitchen window, wide eyes, pale face, sheer disbelief. And behind him, Max continued to sleep peacefully, unaware of the storm raging inside Keanu's mind. Something was happening. Something unnatural, and Keanu wasn't sure he wanted to know what it was. Keanu gripped the kitchen counter tightly, his knuckles turning white. His breathing was shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He needed to calm down, think, process. There has to be a logical explanation. But no matter how many times he ran through the facts, there was no way around it. This was Max. The dog sleeping by the fireplace wasn't just similar to his childhood pet. It was him. But how? Keanu squeezed his eyes shut. Maybe he was exhausted. Maybe being back in this house, surrounded by old memories, was messing with his head. Or maybe, he swallowed hard, maybe some things in this world couldn't be explained. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He turned back toward the living room, his eyes landing on Max's sleeping form. The dog looked peaceful, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He seemed normal, but normal dogs didn't come back from the dead. Keanu forced himself to move, his legs unsteady as he walked toward the hallway. He needed air, space, something to pull him out of this surreal nightmare. He pushed open the back door, stepping outside. The night was still, the sky littered with stars. The cold air bit at his skin, grounding him. He placed his hands on his hips, exhaling sharply. Maybe he was losing his mind. Or maybe, just maybe, a sudden sound behind him made him stiffen. Soft footsteps. Keanu turned around slowly. Max was standing in the doorway, staring at him. His heart lurched. He hadn't even heard the dog get up. Max's head tilted slightly, his eyes glinting under the moonlight. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a sound, Max stepped forward and sat down on the porch, right next to the spot where Keanu had buried him all those years ago. Keanu's mouth went dry. His pulse pounded. This wasn't just strange anymore. This was impossible. And for the first time since seeing Max again, Keanu felt something new creeping into his chest. A cold, prickling fear. Keanu stood frozen on the porch, his breath forming thin clouds in the cold night air. The world around him felt eerily silent, as if the wind itself had stopped to watch the impossible scene unfolding before him. Max sat motionless, his deep brown eyes locked onto Keanu's. There was something unsettling in the way he stared, not aggressive, not threatening, but knowing, as if he was waiting for Keanu to accept what was happening. But Keanu couldn't. He took a slow step back. His mind screamed at him to rationalize, to find an explanation that made sense. But there was none. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, more to himself than to Max. The dog's ears flicked, but he didn't move. A heavy weight settled in Keanu's chest. He turned his gaze toward the old oak tree, the very spot where he had buried Max with his own hands. The earth there looked undisturbed, covered in dry leaves and grass. But that didn't mean anything. What if I dug it up? The thought sent a chill down his spine. If he did, what would he find? Would Max's remains still be there, confirming this was some bizarre coincidence? Or would he find nothing, proof that something much stranger, much darker, was happening? Keanu swallowed hard. He didn't want to know the answer. He looked back at Max, who was still watching him, tail resting still against the porch floor. Keanu ran a hand down his face. Maybe he was losing his mind. Or maybe a new thought formed in his mind, one that sent a fresh wave of unease through him. What if this wasn't Max? What if it was something else, something wearing his face? His stomach twisted. He had heard stories, read folklore, spirits taking the form of loved ones, supernatural entities slipping into familiar shapes. He had never believed in those things before. But now, Keanu's hands curled into fists. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run. But at the same time, a deeper part of him, the part that had spent years missing Max, aching for his presence, wanted to believe. Because if this truly was Max, then maybe, just maybe, some miracles were real. Keanu let out a shaky breath and took a step forward. Max! The dog's tail thumped once against the wooden porch. And for the first time, Keanu wasn't sure if that was comforting or terrifying. Keanu's pulse pounded in his ears. The stillness of the night, the way Max sat perfectly still, the way his tail thumped once and then stopped, it all felt off. But he couldn't run. Not yet. He swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you really Max?" The dog's eyes never left his. Deep brown. Familiar, but different. Max's ears twitched. And then, slowly, he stood up. Keanu stiffened. The dog took one step forward, then another. His movements were smooth, deliberate, not like an excited pet reuniting with its owner, but like something testing the space between them. Keanu felt his breath hitch. His instincts screamed for him to back away, but his feet remained planted. Then, Max suddenly stopped. His nose lifted slightly, as if he had sensed something in the air. And then, ever so slightly, his head turned toward the oak tree. Keanu's stomach dropped. No, A chill crawled up his spine as Max took another step toward the tree. Then another. His movements were too precise, too intentional. Keanu's throat went dry. "No," he whispered. "Don't." But Max didn't stop. His paws crunched against the dry leaves, his tail still, his posture unreadable. He moved with purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was going. And then he stopped, directly over the spot where Keanu had buried him 25 years ago. The night air felt heavier, colder. Keanu's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, to stop watching. But he couldn't move, not as Max, or whatever he was now, slowly turned his head back toward Keanu. And this time, his eyes weren't just familiar, they were wrong. Keanu's blood ran cold. Max opened his mouth slightly, but no breath came out. No soft panting, no warmth, just silence. And then, a whisper, faint as the wind, not from Max, from beneath him, a sound rising from the earth itself. Low, muffled, almost like scratching. Keanu stumbled back, his vision blurred at the edges. His heart slammed against his ribs. Max didn't move. He only watched. And then, the scratching stopped. Silence fell again. And in that silence, Keanu finally understood. This wasn't Max. It had never been. Something else had come back instead. And it had been waiting for him all along. Keanu barely remembered moving. One moment, he was frozen on the porch, staring at the thing that looked like Max. The next, he was inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands trembled as he locked it, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. That wasn't Max. The realization sent a cold wave through his body. The dog had the same fur, the same eyes, the same habits, but the way it moved, the way it stared, the unnatural stillness, it was all wrong. And then there was the scratching, that faint, muffled sound that had come from beneath the earth. Keanu's stomach twisted. He pressed his forehead against the door, trying to slow his breathing. What the hell was happening? A soft thud echoed from outside. Keanu tensed. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned his head slightly, listening. Silence. Then another thud. His breath caught. The sound wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the window. Keanu turned slowly. Through the dim light of the living room, he could just make out the window pane near the fireplace. A shadow loomed there, a shape, a figure. His chest tightened. Then, a soft, deliberate tap against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Keanu's stomach clenched. His hands curled into fists. Don't look, don't look. But he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he raised his eyes to the window, and there it was. Max, or whatever it was now, standing outside, staring in. The porch light cast long shadows across its face, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark, too deep, too empty. Keanu's breath hitched, his legs locked in place, fear rooting him to the floor. Then the scratching started again. Not from the window, from beneath the house. A slow, deliberate sound, something clawing its way up. And Keanu realized, with a sickening certainty, it wasn't just waiting for him outside. It was already inside. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. The scratching beneath the floorboards sent a cold wave through his body. Each sound deliberate, slow, like something trying to find its way out. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to listen. Outside the window, Max, or whatever wore his shape, remained perfectly still. Its dark eyes locked onto him. The tap, tap, tap against the glass was almost gentle, almost patient. Keanu clenched his jaw. Think, focus. His gaze darted toward the floor. The scratching hadn't stopped. It was faint but rhythmic, like nails dragging across wood. Was something buried under the house? The thought sent nausea rolling through him. He had lived here as a kid. He had played on these floors, slept in these rooms, but he had never once heard that sound before. Something was wrong. Something had changed. And then Max moved. It was subtle, barely a shift of his weight. But Keanu noticed it immediately. The dog's head tilted, not curiously, but expectantly, like it was waiting for Keanu to remember. His vision blurred as a wave of dizziness crashed over him. His head throbbed, a sharp, pulsing pain pressing against his skull. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of the couch for support. Then the memories came, not like a gentle recollection, but like a flood bursting through a dam. A night, just like this one, a storm raging outside, his father's urgent whispers, the sound of something being buried, a child's voice, his own, asking, "What are you doing, Dad?" And his father's response, soft, hurried, almost pleading, "Forget about this, son. Never come back here." Keanu gasped, his knees nearly buckling. He had forgotten. He had buried it. But now, someone wanted him to remember. And outside, Max's mouth slowly curled into something that almost resembled a smile. Keanu's breath came in ragged gasps. His vision swam, the weight of the forgotten memory pressing against his skull like a vice. Something was buried here. Not just Max, something else. The scratching beneath the floor grew louder, more insistent. Keanu stumbled back, his knees nearly giving out. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Forget about this, son. Never come back here." But he had come back. And now, it knew. Outside, Max, or the thing wearing his skin, watched. His head tilted just slightly. His mouth parted as if he were waiting, expecting. Keanu squeezed his eyes shut. Think, remember, his father, the storm, the hurried digging, and then the feeling, that sick, awful feeling in the pit of his stomach as he watched his father shove something deep into the dirt. Not just Max, something else, something his father had been afraid of. Keanu's eyes snapped open. His breath came fast and uneven. He had to leave. Now, he turned sharply, his hands fumbling for the doorknob. But before he could reach it, silence. The scratching stopped. Keanu froze. A new sound filled the air, low, hollow, coming from beneath his feet. A whisper, muffled, indistinct. But he understood it. Keanu. His stomach twisted. "No, come back." His breath hitched. Then, the floor beneath him buckled, wood splintered, the sound like a gunshot in the dead silence of the house. Keanu barely had time to react before the boards beneath his feet gave way. He fell. Darkness swallowed him whole, and the last thing he saw before the world collapsed around him was Max, standing at the edge of the broken floorboards, watching, waiting, and then he smiled. Keanu hit the ground hard. His body slammed against damp earth, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, everything was dark, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Then, pain. A sharp, searing ache radiated through his back and shoulders. But he forced himself to move. His hands pressed against the cold dirt beneath him, fingers digging into something soft. Soil. His breath came fast and shallow. He had fallen into the crawl space beneath the house. Above him, faint moonlight streamed through the jagged hole in the floor. The wooden boards hung loosely, splintered and broken. Keanu's pulse pounded. The whisper, the scratching. Something had been trying to get out. Slowly, he turned his head, his breath hitching as his eyes adjusted to the dimness. And then he saw it, a mound of disturbed earth. Not old, not settled, but freshly disturbed soil. His stomach clenched. He could still smell the dampness, the scent of decay lingering beneath the house. Something was buried here. Not Max. Something else. Keanu's chest tightened. His father's words from long ago echoed in his skull. "Forget about this, son. Never come back here." He had buried something that night. And now, after all these years, it wanted to be found. A sound above made him freeze. Soft, careful, footsteps. Keanu looked up, his breath catching in his throat. Max, the dog, stood at the edge of the hole, peering down at him. The moonlight illuminated his golden fur, but his eyes, His eyes were all wrong. Dark. Hollow. Something stared at Keanu through Max's face. A shiver ran down his spine. And then Max tilted his head. A slow, deliberate movement. As if asking, "Do you remember now?" Keanu's body locked in place. He did. And that changed everything. Keanu's breath came in shallow gasps. His hands curled into the damp soil beneath him as the memories came flooding back. All of it. The night of the storm, his father's pale face, the way his hands trembled as he dug, the thing wrapped in cloth, the shape twisted, unnatural, and the fear in his father's eyes. "Don't ask, Keanu. Just go inside. Forget this." But Keanu hadn't forgotten. Not really. His mind had locked it away, buried it deep, just like his father had buried whatever lay beneath him now. A chill crawled through his spine. What had his father done? Above him, Max, ***, or whatever was wearing Max's body. *** remained perfectly still, watching, waiting. Keanu forced himself to move. His fingers trembled as he reached forward, brushing against the disturbed earth. The soil was soft, recently shifted. Something had tried to crawl out. His stomach lurched, but before he could react, the ground shifted. A low, wet sound filled the air, like something pulling free from the dirt. Keanu's breath hitched. Then a hand broke through the soil, pale, twisted, wrong. Keanu scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. His body screamed at him to run, but his limbs felt leaden, frozen in place. The fingers twitched, grasping, feeling. Then another hand emerged, and from above Max moved. Not normally, not like a dog should. His limbs jerked, unnatural, his body stretching in ways that didn't make sense. Then he smiled. Not a snarl, not bared teeth. A human smile. Keanu's blood ran cold. And the thing beneath the earth, it was still coming. Keanu's mind screamed at him to move, but his body refused. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. The thing beneath the earth was still crawling up. Its fingers, pale and dirt-streaked, twitched as they pulled against the soil. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something old and wrong. And above him, Max smiled. Not a dog's expression, a human smile, stretched too wide, too knowing. Keanu's stomach twisted. This wasn't Max. It never had been. A sickening crack echoed through the crawl space as the thing beneath the earth began to rise. Keanu snapped out of his trance. Move, now. He lunged backward, scrambling for anything to pull himself out of the hole. His fingers clawed at the damp dirt, his legs kicking wildly. The wooden beams above groaned under his weight. Then a whisper. Keanu. The voice was familiar, too familiar. Keanu's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was his father's. His chest clenched, panic and confusion swirling in his mind. But he couldn't stop. He grabbed onto a loose floorboard, yanking himself upward. His feet slipped. Behind him, something surfaced. A face, or what was left of one. Sunken eyes, skin stretched tight over bone, lips cracked and moving without sound. But Keanu heard it. Inside his head. You shouldn't have come back. A hand latched onto his ankle. Cold, strong, unyielding. Keanu choked back a scream. He kicked wildly, his boot slamming into something solid. The grip loosened. He didn't wait. With one final, desperate heave, Keanu pulled himself out. He collapsed onto the living room floor, his chest heaving, his vision spun, his body shaking violently. But then silence. Keanu turned, his breath catching in his throat. The hole was gone. No broken floorboards, no disturbed earth, no hand reaching for him. Nothing. As if it had never happened. Keanu staggered to his feet, his entire body trembling. His gaze darted toward the front door. He had to leave, now. But before he could move, a soft thump. His heart lurched. Slowly, he turned his head. Max was gone. The window was empty. The porch, empty. The night stretched quiet and still. For a long moment, Keanu didn't breathe. Then a whisper, faint, barely there. "Goodbye, Keanu." And just like that, the presence vanished. Keanu stood frozen, his pulse thudding in his ears. He didn't know what had just happened, didn't want to know. But one thing was certain, he was never coming back. The night Keanu spent in his childhood home was something he would never speak of again. He left before dawn, never looking back, the weight of what he had experienced pressing down on him like an unbearable force. For days, his mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of him screamed that it had been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by nostalgia and exhaustion. But deep down, he knew the truth. That wasn't Max, the thing that had followed him, that had watched him, that had led him to the buried past. It had never been his beloved dog. It had been something else, something that had been waiting. Keanu realized that he had spent most of his adult life running from his childhood, from his grief, from the questions he never dared to ask. His father's warning had been clear. "Forget about this, son. Never come back here." But why? What had his father buried that night alongside Max? Was it guilt? A secret too dangerous to be known? Or something far worse? Something that had been clawing at the edges of reality, waiting for Keanu to return? He would never know for sure. But one thing was clear: the past never stays buried. Some memories fester beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Some questions should never be asked. Some doors, once opened, can never be shut again. Was Max truly gone? Or had something taken his place, worn his face, used his memories? The way the dog acted, the familiarity, the way it lured Keanu step by step toward the truth, it had felt deliberate, calculated. But there had been moments, brief moments, where Keanu thought he had seen something real in Max's eyes. A flicker of something true. A part of him wondered, had Max been trying to warn him all along? Had his childhood companion returned, not to haunt, but to protect him from the thing beneath the house? Or had Max been lost long ago, and this thing had been waiting in his place? In the end, what scared Keanu the most wasn't the scratching beneath the floor, the distorted smile on Max's face, or even the thing that had tried to drag him into the earth. It was the not knowing what his father had buried, not knowing what had really come back, and worst of all, not knowing if it was truly gone. Because sometimes, the things we run from don't stay buried. They follow, they wait, and they always find their way home.